Welcome, everyone. We will go ahead and get started here. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding AO 2022-116, a ballot proposition to change management authority for the MOA Trust Fund. It is Thursday, January 5, 2023. We are scheduled from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. today. Documents for this work session can be found online at muni.org/worksessions. We'll go ahead and go around the room with Assembly member introductions for the record.
Pete Peterson.
Felix Rivera. Kevin Cross.
Meg Zolotal.
Daniel Volland.
Suzanne LaFrance. And on the phone, we have Mr. Soltz.
Randy Soltz.
Thank you. And also around the table, we have
I'm Dan Moore from Municipal Treasury.
Jim Voitko from RVK.
Blair Christensen, acting municipal attorney.
Ben Bowman, assistant municipal attorney.
Dean Gates, Assembly Counsel.
and from the clerk's office.
Desiree Camacho, Assembly Budget Analyst.
Great, thank you. And we have just been joined by Mr. Constant. And with that, I will say thanks everyone for joining. We don't normally schedule work sessions on Thursdays, but we have quite a bit going on right now with the special meeting tomorrow. So thanks for your flexibility. Thank you for being here. I will go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Moore.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And my name is Dan Moore. I'm Municipal Treasurer. And we are here today to brief the Assembly on the MOA Trust Fund Charter Change Ballot Ordinance. And this is set for a public hearing for next Tuesday night. And I'll say just in one sentence what this ordinance is about. The purpose of the ordinance is to strengthen the governance structure for the MOA Trust Fund for the long term. And we're basing that on best practices that have been provided to us by the MOA Trust Fund's independent investment consultant, and that is RVK. And Jim Voitko to my right is with RVK, and he'll be making the main presentation today. So that's why we're here, is to talk about the governance and how better to strengthen it going forward. And so what I'm going to do, if it's okay, I think I want to make sure everyone has all the handouts here. So there's an agenda to try to keep us on track. And there's some allocation of time there just so we kind of know if we have enough time for all the different areas. Excuse me. And also just so the record shows, Ross Risvold is on the line too, just so you know. And then we have the timeline, which I'll go through. It'll give some perspective. And I'm going to highlight just the very direct points in the ordinance that are being changed. And then from there, we're going to turn it over to RVK, and they're going to do the main presentation. So with that, so just making sure everyone has all the assembly documents and the agenda and the timeline. So if everyone does, I'll go ahead and proceed. So if we look at the agenda, I wanted to introduce some people that are in the room today that were very key contributors along the way. This took quite a number of months to go through this project. And so to introduce, from the Finance Department, myself, Grant Yatrenka, did I pronounce it right? Thank you. Grant, as you know, is newly appointed permanent CFO. So he's been involved in multiple meetings on this particular subject. We also have Jim Voitko to my right. And Jim is the president of RVK. They're based in Portland, Oregon. And Jim's been with the firm for quite some time. And he has led this project, and he has a tremendous amount of experience in the world, the subject of governance, and in the world of investment, and held a lot of very high-level jobs over his entire career. Just as a side note, Jim was hired when he was working with RVK back in 2006, a long time ago, to do another special project, and that was on the cash pool investments. That's where Ross Risvold's group is involved. And back then they produced a very comprehensive report after studying how we invested our cash pool, and came up with very specific recommendations. And it's really a point of pride for Ross's group and for RVK that the city has literally earned tens of millions of dollars of additional cash flow earnings because of the recommendations from their report. So we're very happy to have Jim specifically back with us on this additional project. And we know that they do very good quality work, and just really appreciative of that. So in terms of the commission, the Investment Advisor Commission, they're another key player in all of this. It's a 9-member commission, citizen-based. They're all high-level, very highly credentialed individuals in the world of finance and investment. And so we invited the whole commission to show if they could make themselves available. The chair is currently, her name is Julie Farley, and she is the CFO with Rasmussen Foundation. And so unfortunately, she is a very busy person and could not rearrange her schedule to be here, but she apologized for that. But in the next best in line is Ed Hendrickson. And Ed, if you can just raise your hand there. Ed is the current vice chair of the commission. And Ed just recently retired as a CFO and senior vice president at Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. We also have a third member of the commission, Brandon Renner. If you can stand up, raise your hand. And Brandon is a senior investment portfolio manager with McKinley Capital, which is an investment firm here based in Anchorage. So we have very, very talented people on the investment commission, and we really appreciate their input and advice. We also utilize the law department quite significantly on this project. So we have both Blair and Ben here, and they were both directly involved in meetings and also in specific drafted language that you see in the ballot ordinance. And then, of course, Grant, which I already introduced. So, okay, so those are the introductions. I wanted to go ahead and talk it through this timeline just very briefly. And this is on hard copy form that was handed out today. It's printed double-sided. I divided it up into sort of the Christmas theme here, past, present, and future. And so I'm only focused on the past just to start with, and then at the tail end of the meeting, I'll cover some future dates. But I realized that the assembly members, this trust fund, it started about 23 years ago. So I don't think anyone was around back then. I personally I became the city treasurer the year the trust fund started. So I've been there literally since day one. The trust fund started out, and this was according to the city charter language, it's required that you take the sale of any utility and put those proceeds into a trust fund. And so when we sold the Anchorage telephone utility for about $118 million, that money came into the trust fund, and that's when the trust fund began in May of 1999. Roll the clock forward another 20-some years, and now the city has sold a second municipal utility, Municipal Light and Power. That was in late October of 2020. We received $229 million from that sale. That effectively increased the size of the trust fund 2.5-fold. That is extremely significant. It's not just the dollars, but when you get to that level, it sort of pushes you appropriately into some more complex type investments. There's publicly traded and privately traded investments. The private investment world, you can actually have opportunity for a greater return, but it's much more complicated arrangements. And so we did relook at the way we had our assets invested, and we made quite a number of changes since the sale of MLMP. We even came to the city to the assembly with an ordinance 2020-98, and we expanded our authority, our abilities to invest, and all that. So that was our very first response to the increase in the size of the trust, is to look at how we were invested. We hired 3 new private investment managers, and we kind of went from there. Over the course of time, it became very apparent to the Investment Commission, to the Treasury, the Finance Department, that because it's a bigger fund, it's almost $400 million, we need to do more to think about the long-term outlook for this fund. And so the issue of succession planning came up, the issue of increased complexity with the fund, the need for more formal oversight from an independent group. Those are all themes that kind of ran through this. I've been with the trust fund 23 years. I will not be for another 23 years, right? And I'm actually about to hit 30 years here real soon. Not that that means I'm out the door, but I'm just saying the time is happening quickly here, right? So we want to make sure we're in good position with that. We did hire a new deputy treasurer just in August of this year. That person came in with tremendous investment knowledge and experience. He was actually a finalist for the permanent fund position a number of years ago. So a very strong person was hired. Glenn Cipriano is his name. He's actually out of town right now. Otherwise, he would be here. But we did do that to increase our internal resource. But then we also recognize that we need to really look at the governance structure. So that's where in the summer of last year, we being the treasurer and the investment commission said, because of succession issues, because of complexity issues, we need to formally look at the governance structure of the trust. ever since the beginning of the trust, the city charter has always said that the municipal treasurer, my position, one person, is the sole named fiduciary of the trust. So literally any final decisions, any execution of the trust has to be endorsed by me as the sole fiduciary. It's a lot of responsibility. It's fine. You know, I've enjoyed it, but it is really becoming more challenging time-wise and complexity, et cetera. And I don't think it's really a good fit, this is my opinion, for just one person. And I'm an appointed executive, right? For one person to be the person doing that. So we asked RVK as a special project starting in July to look at this very formally. They developed a draft report. The rough draft came to us in September. A more formal draft came to us in October. And then we had a series of meetings with the commission and with high-level administration and with the law department. And based on all that effort over a number of months, we came up with a proposed ballot charter change to go from a sole fiduciary to a board of trustees. And with that, I'm going to just point to the ordinance here. And just so you know the exact change we're proposing here, this is what's before you. It's AO 2022-116. And on page 2 of the ordinance, okay, we take the existing charter language that's been there for decades, and we only change one small part of it. And that's to really hone in on this issue of governance. That is alpha letter B as in boy, or Bravo. And what we're doing there, and we also, part of, not only we're very laser focused on this governance issue, but we also want to make sure that we say it in a way that is hopefully going to be understandable to the public, because we're asking the assembly to put this on the ballot. And investment issues can be daunting or, you know, a little bit tough to understand sometimes for the public. So what we did is we deleted the reference to municipal treasurer. So no longer it is the municipal treasurer managing. In the future, it would be a board of trustees. And that's the language change. But in addition to that, because someone would say, well, a board is a board, you know, who knows what direction they might go. We tied that board into a standard. It's the gold standard for any type of fiduciary investment board around the country. It's called the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. Okay, this was vetted with RVK and with our law department. This is the gold standard. So you cannot have a board in place that will just go all sorts of different directions that are departure from maybe the historical management of the fund. They have to fill that role in a very fiduciary capacity. So those words are extremely important, and we're hoping that the public, when they read that, the plain language of that, they will get a sense that this is something that is a very formal, responsible approach. The only other language that we put in here for the voters to approve is right before the yes/no section. There is a effective date clause. We know that we cannot flip the switch. One day it's the treasurer, the next day it's the board of trustees. We need quite a bit of time to do that. This is going to be a collaborative effort with the mayor and the assembly to fill out a board. And we're going to talk about what that board might constitute and how it'll get filled out. But in order to do that, we imagine it could take a number of months and maybe maximum no longer than a year. So a year from when the election is certified. We certainly want to be in place sooner than that. But that is the absolute longest period of time we would have to have this implemented. So that is my opening remarks. And I'm going to pause because I think there are a couple questions, and then we're going to get right to Jim to do his main presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I have first Mr. Constant, then Ms. Alatel in the queue.
Thank you, Dan. So for me, this conversation really started when we were discussing the last time the distribution of assets from the interest income of the trust, and the question of should we do 4, 4.5, 5%? And it was fairly asserted that you are the sole entity within our municipality with the authority to finalize that or say whether it was responsible. And at that moment, I agreed with this charter proposal without much question. My question, though, is around that percentage and how the decision is made. When we make our budget based on budget projections, based on our own calculations sometimes. Does this tie our hands in the context of how we choose what percentage we end at, other than the maximum, which is in there already?
Through the chair to Mr. Constant. change things any more than exists right now. What this ballot ordinance does is it changes who the fiduciary entity is. And so you would have similar issues down the road in terms of you may budget a certain number, but the fiduciary, whether like a board of trustees, may find that to be inadvisable at the time. And so they may say, we don't think the trust fund's long-term viability is well served by paying out at too high of a rate. And this past year that we went through, I mean, it was terrible. You could not really invest in anything and make money. So the trust fund is down about 11% for 2022, and that's not even counting in the inflation. So our real return, or when you factor in inflation, it's even worse than that. So if there ever were a year to like back off of the payout rate, it would have been 2022, which we did, and it worked out. But in answer to your question, you would still have the need for dialogue. Certainly, Assembly can appropriate, make whatever decisions, but ultimately, in my opinion, the fiduciary is the one in the best position to make the call on whether it's good for the financial viability of the trust. So
I'll just conclude by saying, even without the rest of this presentation, that it's wise to not have one person be the one who lives or dies by that sword.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the protection of a board is wise. And so this is good policy.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you. So I have a question about naming the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. I see Alaska adopted it in 1998. Do we know if the state adopted the entire act or only portions of the act? And then I have a follow-up question.
Municipal Assistant Attorney Ben Bowman, through the chair, Assemblyperson Zalatel. The state of Alaska has adopted the Uniform Act of 1994. As Dan said, that is the gold standard. Not only that, they have paraphrased, they kind of took about 90% of the Uniform Act and set it as the governing rule for the permanent fund. And we, in choosing to name it and list it in this way, and also the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994 hasn't changed since 1994. It was initiated in 1994 as the first time it was written down, and they haven't changed it since. So we called it 1994 in case it changes in the future.
That's my follow-up question, actually. You have teed it right up. So what if it's updated and we like the updates? And that's my concern, because this is in the charter. I wouldn't want to have to go back to the charter. I know it does say consistent with, but also then if Alaska doesn't adopt that as well, then it's not the governing state law. So I guess I have some hesitancy around, I want to name the gold standard, absolutely. But since it's in the charter, there's some concern or caution in naming something so specific.
Through the chair, Ms. Zalatel, this is Blair Christensen. So this was a topic that was discussed quite a bit between legal and finance and everybody. And I think our concern was that because you would not know what the changes were if it were to be updated from the 1994 version until it happens. And then because it's in the charter, we would be stuck with them. We'd be stuck with an unknown or something that we absolutely didn't want, that we were better off being stuck with a known commodity. And that if we decided that it was worth changing and that we liked the new version better, that we should try to make a charter change again. But legal thought it was a huge risk to change the charter and allow for an amendment of the uniform code without even knowing what that was, right?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess if it hasn't been changed since 1994, maybe it won't change, but I do think it is a small risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Any other members in the queue before I go back to Mr. Constant? Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
So, thank you.
Could you hold on a sec? Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you. I just have a follow-up to Ms. Zalatel's question and concern. I'm wondering if, placing this in charter does require area-wide vote to change. So wasn't there consideration of just a directive to adopt it by ordinance?
Yeah,
And we could put a separate section in this ordinance and direct the assembly to adopt the Uniform the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. And then if it changes in the future, you could make the change by ordinance adopted by the Assembly in code rather than by charter. And was there, I guess, concerns about doing it that way?
I think that to address, this is Blair Christensen, to address Mr. Gates' question, a lot of the thought process was, this is the Municipal Trust Fund. If we are going to change the operations, that the citizens should vote on what those operations are. This is a very long-standing code. Lots and lots of entities use it. The state of Alaska uses it for the permanent fund. If it was decided that it should be something different, that we should probably go back to the citizens and that change of operations through the citizens and have them vote on it. So we did go round and round about how this could possibly be done differently. And in the end, we ended up deciding that because it had been around for so long and it really was the gold standard, that we would put it in the charter, and that changes to that should probably go back through the voters.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I was going to ask the same question. I wonder, like generally accepted accounting practices or other standards that exist in similar fields, if there is a label or identification of a standard other than the law itself that would point to this law, that then we could move this to be updated by ordinance should such a standard change. Because I don't agree that the best path is to send like this very narrow, minute, very specific change that only would make a lot of sense to people who are very versed in the financial universe, but rather it's the general principle, which is the standard. We will manage, this board will apply the standard. So is there such a standard named that isn't the law itself, like generally accepted accounting practices or other?
I can try to address that as best I can. The reason that the Prudent Investor Act hasn't been changed is because it is principles-based. It's not full of minutia. It's overarching principles, I think it's fair to say. And that means that it has stood the test of time as the gold standard. And I am hard-pressed to think of a single major institutional fund in the United States that hasn't either adopted it, or the few that are left are pursuing it. And as a matter of fact, RVK was part of the permanent fund's effort to get the Alaskan legislature to approve this. We did some supporting analysis that showed how much benefit there would be over the long run for the permanent fund if they were able to move to the prudent investor role, and that has proved to be the case. So I think that there's always a chance that some minutia might change, but there's very little minutia, if any, in the act. It's principles based.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine it changing.
What you just said was the prudent investor rule. And it seems like generalizing it to the point where it doesn't specify the exact act is, again, wise. You could say uniform prudent investor standards, which could then allow for the update of this as they change. Pinning it again to a law that is subject to change it's a strange thing. We don't do that in our charter.
So through the chair, Mr. Constant, I think the legal department's concern would be if you are generically saying the prudent investor rule, then you are tying yourself to any case law, any other law that says that is not using the same standard as the Uniform Act. And that certainly would be against the legal department's advice, right? Because you have now taken it from a very well-defined term that's in the Uniform Act to something that is no longer well-defined and very dependent on reading of case law and any variety of different sources.
Okay, so last question then. Could we add a phrase that says Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994 or its successors? some language that, again, provides a methodology for it to advance with the evolution of the potential law.
Through the chair to Mr. Constant, I think the legal department's concern would be, if you were to say that, you would then be stuck with whatever those changes are before they're vetted, right? The minute it takes effect, we would then be stuck with it. We know what this is now. We are okay, like, we're not only okay, we think that what this is the gold standard. If you were to change it and then it automatically updated, if it were revised, you are then stuck with the revised version, whether you like it or not.
Well, except for you could take it back to the voters for a charter amendment within less than a year if the issue was so broad that it was really problematic. That's a stronger case, I think.
And Chair, could I say something really fast? We're talking about the public and the charter and, future changes, which the good thing is this really hasn't changed and it is principle based. So that's very helpful. But also please keep in mind that we're talking about going to a board of trustees. We want that board to have in their heads all the time, there's a specific act that their decisions and actions have to abide by. And that's extremely important to keep the board in line. So that's the other element here I wanted to share.
Through the chair. And to add a little additional information for the governance of the permanent fund dividend, as I mentioned to Assemblyperson Zolotel, they didn't adopt the act by name. They just paraphrased 90% of it into the governing law section. So they made it even more detailed and specific without it being able to change and without a reference to the law itself.
Thank you. I have two other members in the queue. Next is Mr. Boland and then Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if we could just, as far as amending the charter, on that page 2, line 6, remove from this consistent with the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. And then if we could do a concurrent ordinance where we codify that it's consistent with the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. And then that may be more easy for an assembly to update down the road without having to go back to the voters.
And I want to note for the record that we have on the phone by Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Through the chair to Mr. Boland. Certainly the body could do that. I think the danger would be that the intent of putting it in there was to outline how the board would operate as opposed to the treasurer. And by taking that out, you no longer have that operational piece in there, right? All of that is spelled out in the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, how the board operates, what they're bound to, all of those things. By taking it out, you lose all of that security.
Even if we had a concurrent ordinance that the assembly was ready to adopt that said, the MOA Trust Fund Board of Trustees must be consistent with the Uniform Prudent Investor, and then it's just a code change rather than a charter update.
Correct. I believe that you are losing that security because as we're seeing, so as has been echoed here, I think multiple times, what we're recommending is what the PFD does, what all major investment firms do, what everybody is following at this time. You are changing it. So to do it by ordinance, I think you are losing that security for the voters. What was intended was to ensure that we are following these rules, that we're bound to follow these rules. The fiduciaries of the board are bound to follow these rules. I think the idea was that the trust fund is such a large amount of money, and the intent was to benefit, the people of Anchorage, that placing it in the charter creates safeguards to that fund that placing it in an ordinance would not have.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Feel like we're beating on a dead horse now, but I think this is important to get right. So question and then comment. So it sounds like some of you all, especially the attorneys, are familiar with the state process. So I have a question on the state process, so theoretical. So let's say this year there was a Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 2023, and the state legislature liked it. Could the state legislature then pass something that says the permanent fund now must follow, this is the new principles for the permanent fund, the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 2023?
Through the chair, Assistant Municipal Attorney Ben Bowman to Assemblyperson Rivera. The state legislature could, but they would have to fundamentally rewrite the governing rules for the permanent fund, because the permanent fund is even more abstracted and more specific than what we're even proposing. The permanent fund actually doesn't reference the Uniform Prudent Investor Act. It takes the text of the Uniform Prudent Investor Act and cut out a couple of small sections and then just put the whole thing into a separate piece of code. It was separately codified. The Uniform Prudent Investor Rule is separately codified and accepted by the state of Alaska, but the governing structure of the permanent fund is just the text repeated under the law. So they could change it, but it would be a fundamental, complete rewrite.
Great, thank you. So then my comment is, then I think that leaves us with two options. We can either decide that we want to go through that entire process ourselves, which does sound like a lot, or I continue to believe, much like I think what Mr. Constant was trying to do, that there is some amount of flexibility that we can put in here that allows us to follow the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 1994. But if something else comes up that we like, then perhaps the assembly or whichever authorized body could review that and decide we're going to change from 1994 to whatever the new one is. I feel like we can craft that kind of flexibility that provides the assurance. I know what the administration wants. They want that assurance, but also provides flexibility, because I think the voters want that too. I don't think they want us to be stuck with something old or something new and better comes out. Of course, this is all theoretical. Who knows if something new and better will ever come out? But I think we shouldn't get ourselves stuck in something anyway. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Through the chair to Mr. Rivera, are you thinking of something like unless otherwise revised and adopted by a majority of the assembly? Is that, I'm just trying to get a sense of what's going on in your mind there. Sorry.
Good luck. Yeah, I mean, something similar to that. I want us to have a process, whether it's something like that, where we say 1994 and provide sort of a flexibility of if there's a new version that we want to adopt, then we have that flexibility to say, this is the new version now. And without having to go through the whole process of going back to the voters, because what we want is the standard. That's what we want.
So Chris, Mr. Constant is next, and then Ms. Zolotel.
Yeah, I think we're onto something here in the sense that it's kind of funny that as a parallel or an echo of the state process, because we've now talked about the state and how they do this for the permanent fund. One of the biggest political footballs right now is the demand for a constitutional amendment addressing the permanent fund, right? And this, in our own world, would be that issue. We would basically be amending the Constitution and taking from our hands the ability to do the thing that may need to be done. And there is a large faction in the state that would like to see that happen, but not the 65% necessary to move forward with that amendment. And so interesting to find us now here having the same debate around the same issue, just in terms of our local powers. And so I like the idea of coming up with that language. And I also would be okay with adding a phrase along the lines of in conjunction with, based on the recommendations of, or in consultation with the duly authorized board that was created under those standards that we already decided were the gold standard. And so not making it an open checkbook, but making it flexible enough with the bounds of the board itself as part of the conversation. To me, that gets us really close to something that's protected, flexible, and effective.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Zalatel?
So I think the change is easy. If we say Uniform Prudent Investor Act, don't say of 1994. There was only one, as far as I can tell with some quick Google searches, and then put as adopted by municipal code with the following stipulations. And we just adopt the dang act into code. It's what the state has done essentially, but we just do it verbatim. Or by reference. Yeah, super. The simplest way. Because then if the act changes and becomes the act of 2023, we can just adopt, with guidance and, and then adopt it by municipal code. Then there leaves your ability to change it, to concurrently adopt it as something in municipal code. Because I don't think, based on the research I've done here in all of 20 minutes, that the core, they actually call it, because we all love acronyms, the UPIA is really going to shift from being the UPIA. It will more or less be any content changes, which we could then adopt by code.
I see Ms. LaFrance looking over here. I think the legal department initially thinks that could work, but it has to digest that a little bit.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Yes, thank you. I think I need to digest a lot from today as well. And so before I make my next comments, I need to make a caveat that I'm reading this for the first time today, and I'm doing a little research on the fly. But it seems to me that the characterization that this is doing a lot and being structured similarly to how the Alaska Permanent Fund did it by adoption of the statute isn't an accurate characterization, because I think that the Alaska Permanent Fund was enshrined in our Alaska Constitution. It's Article 9, Section 15. And in there, it doesn't adopt specific standards like the Uniform Prudent Investor Act of 94. And in here it says, and I'm just quoting part of it, for the blah, 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 should be placed in a permanent fund, the principal of which shall be used only for those income-producing investments specifically designated by law as eligible for permanent fund investments. And then there's a little more. But it seems like they left it to adoption by law by the legislature. And I think by analogy, the charter is our constitution, our ordinances are our statutes, and we would be designating by law, by ordinance, if we were going to do it similarly to the permanent fund structure. And so that's just kind of my perspective, but I might be overlooking something in the Constitution, and I haven't done more research than the past 10 minutes here. And then I think that I can see some possible floor amendments in our future, so we may be looking at this a little further over the next several days.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Anyone else? Go ahead, Mr. Moore.
Okay, Madam Chair, so I'm going to turn it over to Jim Voitko. I do realize we are getting pretty pressed on time. I don't know if you have the ability to extend or not, but Jim, it was going to take 25, 30 minutes. He can cut it down a little bit, but I just don't want to cut his time too much because he traveled here today to give the meat of the matter. So hopefully we can make sure he has enough time.
Understood. And our next work session is at 2:40.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of the Assembly. I'm Jim Voitko, and yes, I've been in institutional investing for nearly 40 years, so I have the scars to show for it. Our mission that we were given by the trust was to review the current governance structure and recommend one that, based on our experience with hundreds of boards and funds, that's best aligned with your trust and its purpose, strengthening its foundation, as Dan said. And it's essentially you're writing the constitution or the charter for the trust to be managed on behalf of the residents, both current and future, of the city. If you don't realize how precious a gem this is, let me tell you that we cannot find a city in the United States that has a similar endowment. We believe there's a couple in Canada that got them by accident. So this is, please don't lose it. It is so precious. And critical to our analysis and our recommendations is that this is a perpetual asset for the municipality and its residents now and into the future. That's what we embedded in our thinking about it. So here are our key observations. I'm not going to develop a criticism of the sole fiduciary model. I think Member Constant already voiced his view on that, and we would concur with that, as obviously the administration does as well. The first one is that a perpetual trust such as yours is best served by a governance structure that supports, number one, stability, which means resilient in the face of turnover or changes in the political environment or whatever kind of changes. And the reason for that is that the success in institutional investing means the ability of the fiduciaries to stick to a long-term investment strategy. If they cannot do that, then the assets that they are in charge with are at risk. The other is that this stability preserves institutional knowledge, and you'll see in our recommendations about the board and how we recommend that it be constructed, that it has that aspect to it. It addresses that issue. And the other thing is that you want it to infuse with the fiduciaries, this new board, proposed board, a sense that it requires fiduciary behavior. Hence our second observation, which I won't go into, you've already discussed it, that the prudent investor rule, the gold standard, has been adopted widely throughout the United States, is the unquestioned best practice for institutional management of assets across the U.S. The third observation is that a perpetual fund such as yours should be managed to the principle of intergenerational equity. That is, the children of the current residents who will become taxpayers and their grandchildren should have the same benefit, same opportunity to benefit from the trust as the current residents and taxpayers do. This is actually put in the constitution of a number of states in the lower 48 for their statewide, what we call permanent funds, the equivalent of the Alaska Permanent Fund. This issue of principle of intergenerational equity is very critical to the management of the fund. And it goes back to the phrase that Dan used a moment ago, and that is that spending policies have to be in any given year have to be essentially aligned with the ability of the fund to do its job, not only this year, but in future years as well. And that's a complicated task. We also think that a perpetual fund such as yours that should have a measure of independence from the political process. This is a balancing act. If you read our report, you'll see that there's a spectrum. On the one hand, you want public assets to be accountable to the elected officials of the entity that oversees them. On the other hand, best practice is to let assets be invested by fiduciaries with a measure of independence from the political process, which we know has its ups and downs and sideways. I've served in both federal and state government. I'm thoroughly aware of how things can change on a moment's notice, and that's not conducive to the best management of institutional assets, particularly perpetual funds. And the last thing Dan mentioned is that the fund is growing, and if you manage it to the principle of intergenerational equity, and you manage it effectively, it's going to grow. It's going to get bigger. It's going to be a bigger task. It's going to get more complex. If you look, for example, at the asset allocation of the permanent fund, now that's a stretch in terms of size, but you get the point that this is not a job that's going to get smaller. It can only get bigger and more complicated. And so there's a mismatch between the current governance structure, a single individual who happens to have a seat in any administration over the course of time, versus the needs, we think, in our professional judgment, of good management of a perpetual asset. So those are the observations that led to our recommendations, which I'll go to right away, which begin on page 16 in our report. And I'll mention how they address those issues. First of all, we recommend a 7-member board of trustees. We think that addresses the key person risk that is present in the current governance structure. Second is we think it fosters a recognition of the link between investment strategy and dividends, because we envision this 7-member board, to member Constant's question, doing exactly what Dan indicated, which is to essentially watch the spending policy in any given year and make sure that it doesn't interfere and make impossible the ability of the viability of the fund to do its job in future years as well. Essentially eating one seed corn, I think, is the phrase that's often used. It also it essentially aligns with the perpetual nature of the trust. We know that in any given position in government, there can be turnover. You have been fortunate to have somebody in this position in the current governance structure for 23 years in a row. Do you know how rare that is? I mean, we have 200 plus clients. I can't think of a single one that even comes close to that. So that's recommendation number 1. Is 7 a magic number? It's a compromise between the unwieldiness of too large a group, but it makes it large enough so that several other recommendations that we have, such as staggering the board terms, can be actually executed and further with further benefits to the governance structure. Recommendation 2, we mentioned the prudent investor rule. I can't stress enough how important that is. Let me give you a sense of that. When we get a request for proposal to do work for a public entity, 95% of the time we are required to agree that we will be a fiduciary and operate under their fiduciary standards, which is the prudent investor rule in almost every single case. This is how widely adopted that gold standard has been. Recommendation 3 is that a majority of the board should consist of employees that are not currently elected officials, appointed professionals by them, or employees of the municipality. This is not a dig on public servants. I've been a public servant, as I mentioned, at both the state and federal level, but it is one part of several pieces of these recommendations that is intended to establish a measure of independence on one hand for this board, but still retain the accountability to elected officials on the other hand, and through them, the administration and the assembly as well. Recommendation 4, we're recommending that a minority of the board be current employees of the municipality. This is intended to reinforce the side of that balance that emphasizes independence for this board of trustees. And we recommend that the board members be appointed by the mayor with the concurrence of the assembly, because it adheres to the current process that's in place already today. And it gives both the administration and the assembly a voice in those appointments. The recommendation number 6, this comes up quite often. Should you write into charter or ordinance specific industry credentials that board members must have? Believe it or not, even though those of us in the investment, certainly in our firm, have boatloads of credentials, we don't recommend that. Examining somebody's credentials and asking for them is certainly part of the vetting process. But what we have found is that some credentials in the financial services industry are very relevant to the management of a multi-asset class trust like yours, and some just aren't. And so it's very difficult to parse. We talked about in the previous topic, sort of parse the minutia of, well, which credentials do make a difference and which don't. We think it's best to simply say credentials are part of the vetting process. Recommendation number 7, we think that the terms of the external members of the board should be staggered and be of sufficient length so that their terms expire over the course of an election cycle. And what that means is that each administration across the cycle will have an opportunity to leave their mark on the members, the membership of the board if they so choose. But there will be a sense of continuity that will be established in a staggered board so that the board is unlikely to disappear entirely and be replaced by folks that have no history with how the fund got to where it is. But still, it allows for a paced change, a measured pace of change, so that over the course of 2 election cycles, there'll be replacements of board members that will occur on a regular basis. And these use of staggered boards is illustrated in our report on page 18. I won't go into it in detail, except that it's pretty obvious that what we're trying to do is to recommend that the external members always have some of them have terms that move into the next administration cycle so that they can carry the ball for continuity and institutional knowledge of the management of the fund, even if they're eventually replaced by the next administration. Recommendation number 8, we think that if you give a board this responsibility over a gem like the MOA Trust, that it should have the ability to elect its own chair and operate in its own way. And so that is one of our recommendations. We have found in our work with hundreds of boards that on average, way more than average actually, boards that select their own chairs operate better. And it leads to greater collaboration, civility, and all types of beneficial aspects in terms of the interaction of the board members. Like I said, matching the responsibility with the tools that the board needs, which are to both elect a chair, but also to retain its own external advisors. Even in the cases, so for example, I sat on the Oregon Investment Council. The governor appoints all of those people, but the board itself, even though it relies on the treasurer for staff, has an absolute right to go out and hire independent advisors because they bear responsibilities for those assets. And it seemed only reasonable that they should be able to access resources without having to get prior approval of them. And that has worked for decades and worked well. And in fact, it works similarly for a number of other institutions in the lower 48. Recommendation number 9. One of the things that when you create something like this, if you were to adopt this structure, is that you want to put in place not only the structure itself, but the means for it to remain credible and retain trust of the citizens, your trust just generally. The best way to do that is to require transparency. And so in our report, there are very specific recommendations for transparency and reporting of results and activities. Transparency is the key, we have found, in institutional investing for fiduciaries that have been given a measure of independence to be able to retain trust and the confidence of folks like yourself, but also the general citizenry and the beneficiaries of the trust, which are the residents of the municipality. Recommendation number 10, there was a great deal of discussion on this, both internally with the project team, as well as with the advisory council and the treasurer's office. The fund has grown, as Dan said, and it has become more complex. As we've seen that happen, we have seen fiduciary boards build internal staffs. Often they're very small, but they report directly to and spend 100% of their time serving the trust. Your trust is kind of at the cusp of that. And so we had to balance in our thinking, and this is our recommendation, the efficiencies of using the CFO's already present staff to manage the many things that go on to execute investment decisions, funds flows, for example, legal documents, and so on, with the desire and the benefit of having those fiduciaries have at least one or two staff members who are solely dedicated to serving their interests and supporting them. And so you may notice that in our report, we have issues for future consideration. That definitely is one of them. If the trust continues to grow, the case for a small independent staff to serve this board, if you should adopt this in the city, gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And that doesn't mean that the treasurer's office wouldn't be involved. In fact, they may still, depending on how the board and the CFO's office interact, they may still provide the plumbing, so to speak, for the execution of the fund. But it is very important for fiduciaries, if they are going to bear the burden of these investment decisions, to feel like they have been given access to the resources to make sure that they can do the job that they've been asked to do. So with that, I'm going to stop. Dan, did I miss anything?
No, I think you covered the specific recommendations, and that was a good summary. And there's a lot more in the report, so if you have the time, it's worth looking at. But I think that was the core of his recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got two members in the queue. First is Mr. Constant, and then Mr. Rivera, and we'll go ahead and keep going
Ms.
for a few
Zalatel is there
minutes.
too.
And then Ms. Zalatel as well.
I have a whole lot of stuff, I think, now. It's a thought-provoking presentation. You started talking about the GEM. We recognize this is GEM, and in fact, the majority of this assembly are the ones who fought for successfully with members of the administration, some to more than double the trust. And you can see the evidence of that on page 7, which is where it went from $6.5 million in 2019 to $14 million in 2020. And we do have an opportunity coming up in the future, hopefully, to make another substantial increase to this when we receive the MARAD settlement, which is a payment for damage at the port. If we were to come up with a method to bond for the expenses using revenue bonds, use that as our what's called security, the settlement, and then pay that back over the next 25 to 30 years. When that debt's paid, that security becomes a $360 million additional increase or some such. It would cost some money. And so we could more than double it again if we were wise and bold. Now, questions that came up for me. We have struggled with boards and commissions and separation of power and how things are supposed to work. But one thing that's nice about our boards and commissions is there is no removal power except for cause, breach of the public trust or attendance if they don't attend. And so in some ways that part is protected from the political vagaries and the spreading out over time. I think it's fine. I had a question, and I think your last recommendation kind of got to it is, do we have a paid board? Are these people paid? Because if you look at the permanent fund board, they are compensated for their work and time and investment. I think I gather that the argument is, for now, it's the staff, and in the future, it might evolve to the point where you need professionals in those roles, or at least some set of professionals. And that is an area that it sparks a lot of thoughts, and definitely is room for a lot of conversation. I think that I'll try to wrap it up. I have some concerns about the recommendation. Let's see if I can find it again. I didn't make good enough notes for myself. That if it is held within, if the execution is held within the CFO's office of all of the work of the trust based on the recommendations of the board, it wouldn't be so difficult for an unruly administration to pretty heavily lean on the process of that trust to achieve its political goal, because all of the people managing the actions of the board are subject to executive appointment and removal for no reason or for secret reasons, never shared with the public because they're personnel matters. And so I do think that there is some thought that might need to go into that. Does the board, does federal law address concerns like that?
Well, that's a legal question. I want to be careful because we're not attorneys, but I would say this, that there are examples of both, and both can work. As I mentioned, Oregon actually executes through the treasurer's office. The treasurer has one seat on the Oregon Investment Council, which I sat on, and we see other models like that. With an endowment of this size, we also have seen them, for example, at the university level, use the treasurer of the university and sometimes not. But if they don't, then they need a small staff. And by small, I'm talking 3 or 4 people, because the execution of documents, the movement of funds, and the management of external resources like investment consultants, like the custody bank services, if those are going to be done by the board itself, then it needs a small number of bodies to do it.
Right. 2 quick final questions. What's the difference between an appointed professional under your recommendation 3 and someone who's not? Because I would assume that appointee, I don't understand that. I might need to get an answer offline because there are 2 other questions. And then the unrestricted authority to make obligations of expenditures transparently, but without pre-authorization. Could, if that were set up in that way, a board appropriate $10 million for the cause of some analysis that they want to do and really eat into the body of that corpus? What are the checks on that, at least across the market of these entities?
They vary from micromanaging those decisions in such that they go through the actual budget process of the legislative and administrative processes, to having ceilings, for example, put on specific expenditures that above that have to go.
Okay, thank
So
you.
one could balance that. There are a number of ways to address the issue that you have.
Thanks. That's all my questions.
But
Sorry, I ate up all that
Thank
time.
you, Mr. Constant. Oh, sorry, did you
No,
want?
I'm fine.
We've got about 5 more minutes. Next is Mr. Rivera, Ms. Zalatel after that.
Thanks. I'll be brief. So I really appreciate all of these recommendations, and for the most part, I have to chew on them a little more. But I am in agreement with most of these, except for one recommendation, which makes me a little nervous, and it goes to something that you said, which is that you want this board to be independent of the political process, and yet it is appointed by the mayor and approved by the assembly. And to me, those 2 things don't jive, right? So one of the guardrails that we oftentimes use to help at least remove some of the political process from something that should be independent of the political process is having board seats assigned to specific professions or specific categories. Your recommendation number 6, though, suggests not doing that. So that I think is a little bit worrisome to me. So I guess my 2 questions for the administration are: 1, do you initially agree with these recommendations, including recommendation number 6? And then 2, is this really a future issue? Meaning, this isn't something that we're sending to the voters to consider. This is something, if I'm looking at your timeline, May 2023 is really when we're going to get into the meat of all of this stuff, and assuming it gets approved, and really deal with all of those specific details. So if you could address those 2 questions. Thanks.
Through the chair to Mr. Rivera. We're open to, certain paths that we could go. We generally do support what's been recommended by RVK. We have a lot of work to do when it comes to further discussion with the top administration, with the investment commission, with RVK, to sort of try to hash out these details. One thing that is going to be beneficial, and this sort of gets back to Assemblymember Constant's questions, is we do have actually a pretty good baseline to work with, because we have the Anchorage Police Fire Retirement System. And so their board members, they actually do receive a stipend. They also have their own staff that they pay for with their own source of money. They have the autonomy to select services as needed. So I think that's going to be our starting point. But the details that you all are bringing up are very important, very legitimate. And it's going to be a collaborative working process. And ultimately, if you approve and the voters approve, by May, we'll be coming with you with all these details, and there can be further refinement from there.
Thanks. I think okay. It looks like
It just, through the chair, Mr. Rivera, just to quickly follow up on that recommendation number 6, some of the other conversations we had that conversation about professional requirements and balancing that with ability to recruit those kind of high level professionals and be able to fill those seats. So I just think that's something the body should consider.
Okay, great, thanks. I think the only note I want to add is that I think you brought up a board that, if I remember correctly, is actually elected positions, the Police and Fire Retirement Board. Yeah. So that I think is a little bit apples and oranges, but I do appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you. So if this passes and it placed on the ballot and is passed, I would really like folks to do some time thinking about if there is this ability for the trust to retain advisors and spend money, how it intersects with Title VII procurement, just so we're really clear on it up front. That's how we're going to get that transparency. And then in terms of the staggering for the board, I really liked this graphic. It's my preference to ensure that the full board turnover can't happen in under 9 years. So 3 electoral cycles, so that there is no way that the entire board could be replaced in one mayoral term if that mayor is reelected. So thank you.
Madam Chair, just to respond to Ms. Zalatel on the first point, let's see, I gotta get my thoughts here. When we do clarify some of these details, we will be, and can you repeat your first point? I'm just drawing a blank all of a sudden.
Just the intersection of if the board wants to spend money
correct.
and the
Thank you.
intersection with Title VII.
Okay, so under the current charter, current code, treasurer's sole fiduciary, the code actually gives the treasurer the authority right now to not be subject to Title VII. The only thing it does require is that we hire an investment consultant through a competitive process, and then we use the consultant to help us select various providers. So that power already exists today. So.
Okay, thanks. It may just have to be a carryover.
If I could make one quick comment about your staggering, there's 2 ways to get to that point. One is to make the board larger, which has some issues associated with it. The other is, if you notice in our recommendations, we say that if a board member should resign before their term is over, the current mayor can only appoint for the stub period. So that is very helpful. And if that mechanism may in fact get you to the point where you would like to be.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. And we are at the end of our time, but very, very quickly, Mr. Constant, go ahead.
Yeah, so I fail to see at what point the assembly has any say in any of this after, other than accepting or not the appointees of the mayor. And so I would like to know, as this is drafted, what is going to come back to us in the concept of structure, organization, and methods, because I don't see it here. And what I see here is, other than the establishment of that board.
Through the chair real fast to Mr. Constant. That is correct. Right now, the very first hurdle is change the governance structure, which requires the charter wording to be changed. The very next phase of this is the implementation ordinance, which will give you all sorts of details about how it's going to work, all those details that you're wanting to know about. So it's coming, but we have to get through each of these hurdles
And
first.
do we not have to state here somewhere that an ordinance will occur?
I don't know if we have to state it I think it's actually stated in the memorandum, but we also have a draft voter fact sheet that we have prepared. We'll run it through law,
Okay.
but that will be stated intent that we will go ahead and be working on that in consultation with all the different parties. So.
Okay, and with that, thank you all for being here today. Mr. Voitko, thank you for traveling up here from Oregon. Did you have any final words you wanted to say?
No, just it's been our pleasure to support the fund and the city again, and we are more than happy to do so whenever you ask us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to point out that this item, AO 2022-116, will be before the body as a new public hearing item on the January 10 agenda. It's item 14H. It will require a 2/3 majority vote in order to pass and be sent forward to the voters, and that is 8. And with that, we will go ahead and adjourn, and we'll get started with our next work session in just a couple minutes. Thank you so much.